Hi, I'm Tom Coohill. It's June 2009, the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson coming to Albany, New York. I'm from Siena College, and we're up here with Lake Winnipeg behind us, or Winnipeg, not a lake. Winnipeg is the second largest bay in the world. The only larger one is the Bay of Bengal. And Winnipeg is a Cree word for what we call Hudson Bay. What we're doing, and I say we're, I have Brian Massman from Siena doing the video, and Pete Iorizzi from the Albany Times-Union is going to write about this. We're searching for the places that Henry Hudson went on his last voyage. But at any rate, Henry comes in here and spends an inordinate amount of time here. He probably is looking for beaver pellets. There's some legend that he brought home from Albany the first beaver pellet to Europe from the New World. And remember, after Albany was called Fort Orange, it was called Beaverwick. And so there's a lot of money to be made in pelts. There's a lot of money to be made in minerals, especially gold. And the English want a slice of it. England at this time is fighting with Portugal and Holland, which rule the waves. Right behind them is England, and then France and a few other countries. So England wants their slice of the people who live here, warning them about that, if they even did warn them about it. And his ship gets stuck in the ice, and they have to overwinter. They only had 8 months supply. They already had used up about 6 months of that, and now they're facing a long winter, a 10-month winter. They put in at a place south of here, about 100 miles, and we'll take you to that river. Not to the actual place Henry Hudson was, you can't get to that, but to the river itself called the Rupert River, which is famous for its rapids. We'll show you that later in the video. So anyway, he stays over winter, and he hunts and they fish, and they're not bad at it, but they're not as good as the Cree, and so they're starving. They're not dying, but they do, one or two of them do die, but scurvy is taking over, they're malnutrition, they're getting on each other's nerves. Henry is famous for not getting along with the natives, and so, it's that blast of water, just got your camera, but it looks fine. Henry is not getting along too well with the natives, and they don't care for him. In fact, there are stories of when he left the ship with his men to try to hunt, the natives setting the forest ablaze to keep them from going any further. They make it to the spring, and the spring is June, and now we're here in June, and look at how I'm dressed. So it's not a spring that we're used to, or a summer that we're used to. So in June of 2011, they start to leave. They try to leave this area, and they're having trouble doing it. As we'll see, there's still ice in the bay at this time of year, and he thinks he can get away, but he can't. So what he does is he talks to the men. They have about 10 days food supply left. They're not doing well trading with the Indians. The Indians sort of get fed up with Henry and don't want to deal with him anymore. And the Half Moon starts its journey north, and he tells the men they're going to go west to the Northwest Passage, and the men mutiny. There's two reasons probably why they mutiny. One, they believe that Henry is hoarding food for the favorites he has on the ship. Another one is he wants the Northwest Passage, and they just want to go back to England, where they're from. And so anyway, in June 22nd to be exact, the longest day of the year, they mutiny, and they take Henry and put him in a small boat with his son. His son's name is Jack, who was sailing with him, a young kid, about 12 or 13. And they put a couple of the sick crew, because they didn't want to deal with that, and a couple of Henry's favorites, and they put them all, 9 of them, in a boat, including the carpenter. The carpenter they wanted to keep on the ship because he's a valuable guy on the ship, but he wants to go with Captain Hudson. And so they put him on a ship and they sail away, and there they go. So as far as Henry's concerned, that's the last we know of him. We have his ship logs up to August of the previous year, but we don't know any more about it. So now the story takes a funny turn, because now you have to rely on the mutineers telling you the truth. And we know they contradicted themselves many times, because like all men at that time who could write, and half of them could write, they kept diaries. Even when they got back to England, they told stories that were not consistent with what they said in the diary, and then sometimes they were. When they get back to England, 2 of the men are already dead, the main mutineers, and the other ones are convicted of mutiny and told they were going to be hanged, but they're not hung. We'll show you later that they're brought back to this bay the following year because they lie. They say they had found the Northwest Passage, so this makes them more valuable to the English and keeps them alive. In fact, they're never killed. They always think, well, maybe these guys know something that'll help us. Okay, that's those guys. They're back in England. Several of them are dead. Some of them are sailing back here in a year or two. Some of them make several voyages back here. So they stay alive. What happened to Henry and his 9 men? We don't know. There's legends. He could have died in the boat. Not likely for a good mariner. If he got in trouble, he'd just take the boat to shore. But what happens when he gets to shore? He's already had trouble with the Indians, and he may not get along with them, and they may not be interested in helping him, and he could starve on land. Or he could get back on the boat and try make another attempt, and a combination of those things could have easily happened. On the other hand, there's a legend that he did get at peace with some of the Cree, and in fact stayed here and married into the Cree people, and even sired children. And that's one of the reasons we came to the village of Wamingi, which is a Cree village, because some of the elders there believe that's exactly what happened. So they think Henry Hudson is buried somewhere near here. There's supposedly a grave, but no one can find it for us, of a red-bearded man who was very short. That would be the carpenter. And but nobody's been able to find it. It's very acidic soil here, so that things are probably wasted away. Historians haven't spent much time thinking about this, and probably because it's futile. It's hard to determine what happened, and a historian likes to have facts, and there are hardly any facts. Archaeologists have done a little work on it, again, not as much as you might expect, and maybe it's futile as well. But we're amateurs. We're not constrained by those professional desires. So we're just up here seeing what we can see, talking to these people. George certainly thinks Henry Hudson remains of him are around here somewhere. So George is taking us out as far as he can into Hudson Bay to see what we can see. Whether we get to any places where we can see remains of at least European, if not Henry Hudson, dwellings, we don't know. In 1617, a crew came back and they found evidence that there were houses, or at least huts, that looked like they were built not in the Cree tradition, but in the European tradition, and perhaps the men survived for several years and then died out. And so, whatever happened, within a dozen years, the Hudson Bay Company was formed, and the Hudson Bay Company was not into minerals because they knew that wasn't working. So they were into pelts, beaver pelts in particular, and that company became one of the richest companies in the world. Henry Hudson, therefore, became a very famous guy. Whether he deserves all of that fame, we don't know. There's only one person in the world with more land and water named after him than Henry Hudson. But certainly he got credit for several things he didn't do, but then there's a lot of things he did do, including coming to Albany and open up New York and coming up here to Hudson Bay. So what we're going to do is tack to and fro in this bay with George, our boatsman, and a couple of his helpers to see what we can see and to come back to Albany and to tell you a tale. Now, whether it's a tale that's accurate, we don't know. We probably have no way of proving it, but at least we'll tell you what we've learned and let you see what you think about it for yourself. We're out on this island. We're pulled over to show you that we really can't go very much further because of the ice. Not only are the ice floes getting large here, but they're moving. They're split. So that obviously if one of them hits your boat at the wrong angle and you're going at the wrong speed, you could get into a lot of difficulty. So our Inuit, George, has taken us up here to show us that's about it as far as we can go in the bay in June. Now within a month or so, by the end of July, a month and a half, much of that ice will be gone, and we could actually sail to the other side of the bay, which is 500 miles away. That's where Fort Albany is, or Albany Island. We're not going to go there. In fact, with no reason to go there at all. So Henry Hudson, of course, was in this area at some time, and he was, as he charted this bay, as I said, he charted almost the whole bay, quite a bit of it, probably looking for a good anchorage, probably looking for some place where they could come back and set up a fort to subdue the Indians, and then eventually to set up a place where they could look and start trading furs, and that eventually happened. That's the Hudson Bay Company. But what we're seeing now is the extent, and here he's trying to do this right around this time in June, and he's running into difficulty. Now you can imagine the crew seeing that the water to the east is pretty clear, the ice floes are small, saying, let's go home. And Henry's saying, no, we're going to figure out a way through this ice to go to the Northwest Passage. And the crew's saying, sorry, Henry, but we're not doing that with you. Now, the Northwest Passage by the 1630s or 1640s was thought to be a myth. They finally thought that they could never get through, that it was blocked with ice. There is a strait there that exits Hudson's Bay to the west, but it was always ice-covered year-round. Due to global warming, it now isn't. It's now open, and for several months of the year, you would be able to sail a boat from Europe right across from China. It looks like it may stay open for 4 or 5 months of a year, and then eventually, the way the ice is melting so rapidly in the Arctic, it looks like it will perhaps be open almost year-round, perhaps 9 or 10 months. So the Northwest Passage is a reality, but the Panama Canal and other things have made it a little less exciting. Worldwide trade does all sorts of other things, but I think that you'll see traffic through that within a decade. That it'll become common for goods to go through the north of Canada to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic rather than going down to the Panama Canal. So this ice is here. There's nothing we can do about it. We're going to probably play around on it. We're taking our photographs on it, having a good time. But there it is, Winnipeg, or Hudson Bay. And there's the old one down here, right?
That's the old, look,
yeah.
Old factory.
Yeah.
Old Wimingi.
Yeah.
Wimingi right here, right?
Yes.
We coming out here.
Yes.
We got wet here. You see those are little houses standing up?
Yes.
It's right here.
Okay.
It's where we are right here, right now. We want to face that. That's where we want to go down here.
Okay.
It's another 10 minutes to go from here.
That's Hilltop?
10 minutes, yeah.
We just left the island where we ate and we're going to Old Paint Island. The paint means the paint, they got red ochre from these hills and they use that for their war paint. And so the name Paint is all over this place. It's also called High Hill because there's the grave of a white man, and we'll tell you when we get to the grave why they think it's a white man here, and that's why we're going. It's one of many graves that people think could have been Henry Hudson or his crew. We're seeing loon landing, big birds. We're seeing Canada geese. What we're not seeing is we're hoping to see a polar bear. Polar bears come into these waters at certain times, and there's enough ice out there that they could get close. We'd love to see a polar bear running along an ice floe or running along the shore or even swimming up to the boat. It doesn't look likely that that's going to happen. But at any rate, these graves are certainly European, and we'll tell you why when we get there, but there are several of them in the area, and nobody knows who they are and why they're there, and that's part of the whole mystery of the myth of, or the legend I should say, not a myth, obviously Henry Hudson was here and he died. So it's part of the legend of what happened to Henry Hudson. So we're going to go up to this island and then we're going to climb about 400 feet, that's the height of this hill, and we're going to be shown this grave and we're going to explain why George and Duck, which is our other guy in the front here, know that, can tell us the reasons why this is obviously not a Cree grave or not an Inuit grave. George is white and I'm sorry, George is Inuit and Duck is white. His name is actually Douglas, and the natives thought his nickname meant Duck. But anyway, we're going to do that, and we'll get back to you in about 2 or 3 minutes. This is a grave. Nobody knows whose grave it is, but it's probably not an Indian grave. If it were Inuit or Cree, it would be facing this way. The Cree always bury their dead with their heads facing the sun as it rises in the east. This grave is in this direction. It's very old wood. It's not at all in the style of an Indian burial, and it's believed to contain the remains of a white man by oral legend. However, nobody's dug it up. The soil is very acidic, so the bones may be gone anyway. Probably couldn't do any DNA analysis. The other thing is that over the years, the stones have been moved, most likely by some large animal, perhaps even a polar bear, just playing around, sniffing, hearing, smelling something. So instead of having a nice layer of stones in the right direction, you have the stones that were obviously the large ones were put here for a burial, were now moved. There are several graves on this island. This is called the island of Old Paint, as I was saying on the way in. From the ochre that's in the rocks here, the Indians made their war paint. What's behind me now is the Rupert River, and I'm shouting because the rapids are so loud. It's this river, or at least where this river enters into Hudson Bay, a couple of dozen miles west of here, where Hudson overwintered. He didn't want to overwinter. Remember, he was in Albany in 1609 and came up here in 1610 and overwintered till the spring of 1611 at the mouth of this river. Now, the problem with that is they were hunting, they were fishing, but they weren't very good at it. And they started starving. They bartered some with the Cree Indians, but Hudson was famous for not getting along with the Indians, and the Indians apparently hadn't had enough of them and just deserted them at one point. So after overwintering in the river, obviously they didn't come up this far because of these rapids. You can never get through these rapids. Enough rapids at Colorado and other places. And these are above a class 6. You can't do it. You see those plumes down in the middle, you can never get a raft through here. And even though it looks like you can go down here very quickly, you're going to hit solid rock. So 399 years ago, Hudson was here. And when the weather broke in June and he tried to get out with his men mutinied. They were starving. He wanted to go further in the Northwest Passage, supposedly, and his men didn't want to do that. So they just mutinied, and they put him and his son and some of the crew into a small boat and sailed away. And that's the last we know of Henry Hudson. Everything else is legend. Hi. In the boat we told you about what we think may have happened, or the various options of what may have happened to Henry Hudson after the mutiny. How he might have been stranded, how he might have died in the boat, how he might have really integrated into the Cree people, and his genes may be in the descendants of the people in this little village of Wamingee. Now we're going to tell you a few things about what may or may not have happened afterwards. Most of this is fairly accurate because it comes from ship's logs. And a ship is almost required to keep an accurate log of what happened. Now, the year after Henry was lost, 1611, the vessel makes it home with most of the mutineers, and the 9 of them. 2 of them died. Several others got lost on the way. The 2 main mutineers, Jewett and Green, were gone. And now what does Britain do with these guys? They were under the edict of being hung, but they weren't hung. In fact, they delayed the trial for 5 years. But immediately, the next year, 1612, they send out 2 vessels. The Discovery again, and the other vessel, I can't think of his name at the moment. But anyway, they come again to this bay. Now, they have 3 of the mutineers with them. And the reason they have those with them is, and the reason they probably didn't hang them, is they started changing their story. And even though in some of the logs and some of their own diaries, they had said part of the reason they mutinied was not just because of lack of food and Henry not distributing the food fairly, but because Henry wanted to find the Northwest Passage, and they were tired of that. They now started talking like they knew where the Northwest Passage were. Why would they do that? Well, they would do that because they wanted people to find some use for them, not hang them. And of course, the first use for them is to send them back on the next voyage. I think the other boat was called the Repulse. So the Repulse and the Discovery set sail from England to find this Northwest Passage. They don't stop at the Hudson Strait, the Furious Overfall, like all the other vessels did before Hudson, or probably the Portuguese got through before even him. But they do get there, and they make their way through knowing there's a bay on the other side. Now remember what I told you about that. You had current in that strait coming furiously to the east, and also on the northern edge of the strait, furious to the west. That's what made that strait so damaging, because you had eddy currents, you had whirlpools, you had tides, 53 feet tides. It's an amazing problem to get through there on a vessel. Added, in any time of year, especially in the spring and in through June and July, you have large chunks of ice roaring through that current, and if they strike your boat, you're gone. They make it anyway. They make it through this passage, and they get into Hudson's Bay. And then they're supposedly on a rescue mission, because obviously they're going to tell everybody we're going to find Henry and his other crewmates, because that's the right thing to do. But they spend all of their time going around the northern part of the bay, looking for the Northwest Passage. There's no doubt on these voyages, there was nothing but the Northwest Passage in their mind. Now, the crew had told them that they had gotten to the Northwest Passage, but now the crew is talking like they don't know where it is and things have changed, and the captain's starting to wonder if this crew really knows what they're talking about. But one thing seems clear, and again, this relates to the ship's logs. Nowhere in the logs of either of those ships, the Repulse or the Discovery, do they say they come this far south to this area, the James Bay area of Hudson's Bay. And the crew had already told them a year before that that's where the mutiny occurred. Now, why would they not come here if their main mission, other than the Northwest Passage, is to find Henry Hudson and bring home the survivors? Who knows? It could be that the crew lied again and said, well, we set them off in the boat, but they followed us for a while, and we know they made it to the northern part of the bay. Or more likely, the crew didn't want them to come down here. By crew, I mean those three survivors, the three mutineers, if you will, because on odd chance they might find Hudson and they might find the rest of the survivors, and then those three guys would probably be hung. So you have all of these problems going on in the minds of those three men and in the captains who don't know whether to believe them or not. So they spend a lot of time in the northern portion of the bay, not down here, and the Repulse gets stuck in the ice and crushed and sinks. And the Discovery, the very ship that Hudson came into this bay with, rescues them and brings them home. So in 1612, they go home and they say, we can't find the Northwest Passage. Several other attempts are made, and they finally, in about 1619, say, as far as we know, there is no outlet to Hudson Bay that will take you west, and they give up on that quest. Now, they were right. The ice blocks the western exit of the bay all year round until recently. With global warming, that ice has now receded, and actually now you can, at certain months, go all the way from England to the Pacific in the Northwest Passage ice-free. And you'll be seeing more of that as the ice consistently retreats. The Arctic ice is shrinking quite a bit every year, and the Northwest Passage has become a real thing. However, a few dozen years after Hudson, Hudson's Bay Company comes here and sets up an enormous operation that becomes one of the wealthiest companies in the world, not trading for the ore and the minerals that Hudson was looking for. He was certainly looking for those, but for the beaver pelts that he brought back. So the fur trade becomes an enormously important thing, and Henry Hudson becomes a bit of a hero. Even though he has all of this territory, the Hudson River, Hudson Bay, Hudson Straits, all towns named Hudson, named after him, it's hard to determine whether he deserves all of that or whether he doesn't. There were other explorers here before him. There were others after him. The Hudson Straits should have been named after several other people, including Davies, who discovered them when Hudson was just one of his seamen. But at any rate, a Dutchman wrote a book about Hudson in which he was laudatory on one hand, but also accused him of being a spy for the British on the other. And so he became a very fanciful character. Some people say he shows up in various forms in Shakespeare's plays as some character, some mariner. And so he becomes very famous posthumously. And of course, it's kind of romantic. Is he still alive? Is he fathering children among the natives? Will he someday return like Captain Bligh did after the mutiny, mutiny on the Bounty, or whatever? Will he ever come back? And he never comes back. But the legends continue. This goes on for, about 130 years, until finally this bay is completely charted. The shores are becoming their forts all over here. In fact, about 500 miles directly west of where we stand here on Hudson Bay is a fort called Fort Albany. And our boatsman, who you met just previously, George, when I told him I was from Albany, he thought I was from Albany Island, Fort Albany, which is right across the bay, where I suppose a few thousand people live. And when I told him I was from Albany, New York, he more or less didn't know about Albany, New York, but he knew about Fort Albany across this bay. So Hudson and Albany are intertwined in many, many different ways. I think Hudson, if he were alive today, would be shocked that New Amsterdam, of course, was formed a few years after he died, would be called New York, and Beaverwick, Fort Orange in Albany, would then be anglicized to Albany. Although he was an Englishman, so calling things after the Duke of Albany would not be the worst thing in the world. Then this bay became extremely famous for trappers, and even now the Cree people make their living mainly by running trap lines around here. One of those trap lines is called Little White Man, and it's been known to be called Little White Man for hundreds of years. Some people say that was a trap line that was set by Henry Hudson's son Jack. Again, we have trouble getting anywhere. In June, there's a lot of ice on the bay, and we don't want to go out too far. We went out a little bit in the boat, but you can't get that far because she could be crushed by ice. And it's the worst type of ice. It's cracking up right now and reforming and floating towards you and floating away from you. And we have to be very careful of that. So we couldn't make the journeys we'd like to make. In fact, to do that, you'd have to come back here in late July or early August when the ice is pretty clear. Before the fall starts, and in October the ice starts to set again. So we've kind of finished this part of our journey, but we have a surprise in store for you at the end of the video that also is going to show you something about Henry Hudson and a legend among a different tribe, the Ottawa, in southern Ontario, which is going to be about 600 or 700 miles south of where we are now. So what we've done is we've come now. This must be, let's see, 400, it's about 800 miles, a little more than 800 miles from where we started up on Hudson Bay to get the first piece of solid evidence of Henry's perhaps demise, or at least what he was doing after the mutiny. The mutiny was in 1611. He sails into the bay in 1610, the year after he was in Albany. So he sails the Discovery into the bay in 1610. 1611 is the mutiny. And that's the last we hear of him. But yet this stone is uncovered in 1959 when they're building a road. They unearth this thing, and it says on it, HH 1612 captive. Some people believe this is Henry Hudson, 1612, the year after the mutiny, being held captive. By who? Well, it's quite possible, since he had a small boat, that he negotiated the rivers and kept trying to come south to see if he could be rescued. He gets this far south, again 800 miles south of where we started, and he finds himself captive. And who would have captured him? It would have been the Ottawa Indians. There are some oral traditions among the Ottawas that he was captured. A white man was captured. They wouldn't have cared what his name was. And that what happened to him after that, we don't know. Did the Ottawa kill him? Did they let him marry into the tribe? Who knows what happened to Henry Hudson? But at any rate, this is the only real evidence that looks like it's genuine. Now, how do you prove? It says at the bottom here, it says, we hope some archaeologists will come here and see if they can figure out if this stone is genuine. You can't date a stone with radioactive carbon and figure it out. Stones are ancient, and you wouldn't have the disparity between the years would be too great. So how do you tell what this is? You might have some expert and say, well, that's the way 1612, that looks like the way it would be carved by a guy of that period. The 6 is a little different and almost looks like a G than I would carve a 6. Maybe that's the way they wrote that day. But remember, they're doing this with a chisel and or stone, not a chisel, but a stone upon a stone, and they're not going to be able to get it as accurate as it like itself. So you can't see his handwriting. Some people say this HH is an old symbol for the Ottawa Indians anyway, but and they have found other stones with just HH along the river. Well, it could be, you could argue that Henry was writing HH on stones more or less as he went down, and he finally got to a place where he had enough time to write HH 1612 captive. So we're going to have to leave this stone because we can't interview it, can't tell us much about it. The people in the area just know they have it, and they're almost pleading with somebody who can perhaps do inscriptions to come up and decipher this and to tell them whether it could be genuine. If it is a hoax, nobody has owned up to it. It went out 57 years from the time of the discovery of this stone, and remember, it was unearthed, it was underneath the ground. So 57 years later, nobody said, oh, I did that hoax, or somebody else did that hoax. So we're going to have to end our saga of what happened to Henry with this solid object and say maybe he wound up captive in the Ottawas, maybe he didn't, maybe he married into the Ottawas, maybe he was up with the Crees, maybe he died in his boat, maybe he died in a watery grave, as some people say. So Henry remains elusive. Who knows, maybe he even made it to Albany and he married into the Albanians. So we'll see you. This is from Siena College, Tom Coohill, Brian Massman, and Pete Iorizzo from the Albany Times-Union, signing off on our quest to find Henry Hudson.